Okay, so let's make a start. Thanks for joining us, everybody, and welcome to this webinar, Leveraging SAP GRC for the GDPR. With less than 3 months away, GDPR is no doubt very much in focus. Today, as part of our ongoing GDPR series, we're going to focus on how to leverage SAP GRC to help you with your preparations and with your ongoing compliance efforts. In terms of today's speaker, we are going to be taken through a presentation by Richard Hunt from Turnkey. So if you've joined one of our Key Insights webinars before, or you've worked with us, then you'll no doubt know Richard. Richard is the Managing Director of Turnkey. He's got over 20 years' experience in SAP security and controls and has worked on numerous projects involving data privacy well before GDPR became a concern. So you're in very good hands for this webinar. Just before I hand over to Richard, we will take questions at the end. So if you have a question, please enter it into your chat box. So don't forget to submit it. We're also recording the session, and it will be available to you in the next few days. So without further ado, if I can just hand over to Richard. Richard, are you there?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you perfectly.
Oh, thank you, Craig. Yeah, so as Craig said, I've been involved in a number of data privacy projects sort of throughout my career. So hopefully the latest iteration of that is the GDPR, which is something that obviously a lot of organisations are focusing their efforts on. Hopefully we can cut through a little bit of the scaremongering today and just talk a little bit about some of the practical applications of the SAP GRC tools that some of you are invested in, some of you may be considering, etc., and how those can be applied to your organisation to support you. So before I start, just a sort of high-level overview of what we're hoping to cover today. I'm going to give you a very brief introduction to GDPR. I don't want to focus on every aspect of it, but I'm aware that some people may be looking for some high-level information about that as well. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the key considerations that you need to have within an SAP environment from a GDPR perspective. And then we're going to look at how you can apply the SAP GRC tools and the functionality within those that supports GDPR compliance. And then briefly towards the end, a little bit about the options for implementing that. Okay, so before I sort of get into the GRC aspect of things, just a very high level, what does GDPR stand for? The General Data Protection Regulation. It's a European Union regulation that's coming in on the 25th of May, which is only a couple of months away now. The thing that's got everybody talking and that's got everybody thinking about it is the fact that there are some quite significant penalties available to the legislators should they wish to fine organisations for non-compliance. So just to stress, this is a maximum fine, but there is a maximum fine of up to 20 million euros or 4% of global turnover, whichever is higher. That obviously doesn't mean that that fine is going to be used indiscriminately, and it's highly likely that fines would be a much smaller order of magnitude than that. But this is something that has teeth to it in a way that some of the previous data privacy legislation wasn't really enforced. I think it's worth highlighting as well that the GDPR is not really bringing anything new in or significantly new in terms of new thinking around how to protect data and how to consider data privacy. It's really just giving teeth to a lot of and harmonising a lot of legislation that's been there over time, or a lot of thinking that's been there over time. So the key point to highlight with that is if your organisation has done anything around data privacy or data protection in the past, in terms of defining policies and procedures that you're going to operate for that, it's quite important to dust that off and look at a gap analysis between that and what the GDPR might be asking you to do, rather than feel that this is something entirely new that you need to start from scratch on. It's quite likely that you've defined somewhere along the line some good practices around data privacy and data protection, but perhaps haven't been living those policies or haven't been operating those procedures. So I think it's quite important for organisations to look at what they should be doing, what they've said they would do in the past, as a starting point, rather than looking at this as a blank page. So, how can your GRC investment support the GDPR? So what I'm going to do here is step through a few key concepts within the GDPR, and then with each of those I'm going to give some examples of how you can apply the GRC tools to that. So the first one is the sort of concept of personal data, really. So unfortunately, there isn't a definitive definition within the legislation as to what's personal data. So it's quite important for your organisation to take a viewpoint on that. There's plenty of guidance. There are some specific examples in the legislation that will definitely be considered sensitive data. But the sort of tail end is definitely open for interpretation. So a few examples there of things that you might consider sensitive that you would be holding in your SAP environment. Obviously, the HR side of things, there's plenty of data in the HR system that would be considered sensitive. Information around sick leave, medical information, personal contact details of your emergency contacts, etc. And then various other things that you might not have immediately thought of. So if you've got independent contractors working for you, they'll have a vendor account, if the bank details are on there and you're paying that contractor directly, then that might be considered sensitive data. Job applicants, there's a lot of information here around CVs, etc. We're talking quite specifically around SAP today, but it's important to stress that both structured and unstructured data is relevant here. So if you're holding CVs on your laptop, or if you've printed them out even and kept them in a pile somewhere, that would be considered sensitive data from a GDPR perspective. So it's not just about the data that's held in your systems, it's also about any other data that's held in an unstructured way as well. So how can GRC help you with that? Well, you've got a Rolls-Royce in the SAP GRC access controls tool for the management of sensitive data. And it's quite, once you've defined what data you're holding in SAP that you're concerned by, it's quite straightforward to extend your GRC access controls rule set to include the monitoring of that sensitive data, what you might consider critical access risks, etc. We've done some work on a starter for 10, as it were, in a rule set for GDPR at Turnkey, but you'll have a viewpoint based on the data you hold in your SAP environment as to what's sensitive and what's not. And it's quite, I think it's good practice to consider defining a rule set that gives you those one-sided risks, and then perhaps a slightly different monitoring procedure that you might operate around that, perhaps looking at it more frequently, perhaps workflowing it around the organisation to validate the appropriateness of that access on an ongoing basis, maybe monthly, where you may not do the same level of monitoring or validation for data that you wouldn't consider as sensitive as that. With the non-compliance risks with GDPR, it's obviously worthwhile adding additional rigor around that, and you can do that within your existing access controls tool. And then you could potentially include some scheduled reporting to the data privacy officer, which is going to be a key role going forwards in terms of your data privacy compliance, GDPR compliance. Within the GDPR, there's a concept introduced called privacy by design, which I actually think personally is quite a nice way of encapsulating some of the spirit of the legislation, really. It's very much intended to ensure that people build thinking around how they're going to protect data and how they're going to protect people's privacy rights into the way that they design their processes and applications from the start. So it's essentially saying, or my interpretation of it is that when you're designing new solutions and new applications, etc., you consider data privacy from the outset. You do things like reducing the amount of access to the minimum necessary to data that might be considered sensitive, ensuring that you're designing archiving policies in and data retention periods in from the outset, and really just considering the data privacy implications of any system change, really. You're going to likely have a policy and process in place for things like considering IT security in projects. So there's quite a lot of examples where you might want to mirror an existing policy to apply similar rigor around data privacy. So, for example, looking at how you look at the security impact of a project, and maybe doing the same from a data privacy point of view at the same point in time during your solution development life cycle. So process controls here. So process controls. The SAP GRC tool would use process controls here as a way of supporting that process, as a way of capturing the data on an ongoing basis, allowing you to use some self-assessment functionality within GRC, both within process and risk management, actually, that you could apply to this to give you the ability to do some scoping questions to determine the level of data privacy concern there might be with that application. You can distribute a privacy impact assessment through workflows. You might be triggering that using an external source, maybe a project management tool or something like that. And you can track the completion of those privacy impact assessments, and there's some nice remediation and escalation functionality within the tool that will allow you to escalate those if they're not being completed on an ongoing basis. And that obviously gives you the information you need to report on that from a governance perspective. So you can say, potentially on a monthly or weekly basis or whatever, that 80–90% of your projects have had privacy impact assessments completed. So you can really kind of track and govern the process, which is quite an important part of achieving another requirement that I'll come on to in a bit around accountability. There's a slight distinction in my mind and in Turnkey's interpretation of the legislation, at least, between what we might call a privacy impact assessment, which is necessary for every project to determine whether there's any form of privacy impact, and a data protection impact assessment, which is a specific requirement under the legislation that needs to be created for certain types of data. So we can apply those. You need to do some screening questions during that privacy impact assessment to determine whether the data protection impact assessment, the DPIA, is actually going to be required. And that will be required where it's likely to result in high risk or harm to an individual if the data was lost. Again, similarly, we can apply the self-assessment functionality to the completion of the DPIA. And using process controls, again, we can store that. It's quite important to have a sort of repository of this information. If you've completed privacy impact assessments and DPIAs as part of the ongoing your ongoing efforts for compliance, it's going to be important to be able to lay your hands on all that information should that information be required at the point in time that you get audited or investigated from a compliance perspective. And process controls at the heart of it is very much focused on having that centralized repository of data required at the point in time when you're going to be asked to demonstrate compliance. So it's a natural fit in my mind, as a store of this data and a repository of compliance data. It was originally designed from a SOX compliance perspective, but some time ago SAP extended the capabilities of all of their GRC tools way beyond SOX compliance to any regulation, really. And in my mind, this is just another regulation that the tool can be applied to. So the next aspect I wanted to mention was breach notification. So within the GDPR, there are some specific requirements around what's considered a personal data breach. So if a breach has been highlighted, then there needs to be an internal log of that data and a register held. If a breach is considered likely to result in a risk to the rights and freedoms of the individual that personal data relates to, then the breach needs to be notified to the supervising authority or supervisory authority, which is a specific term under the legislation defining the authority that's going to within whichever member state that your supervising authority sits. So the legislation actually highlights ways in which you can determine who the supervisory authority is for your particular organisation. Sometimes you may have a choice as to which one you deem to be your supervisory authority. But should you, so for example, in the UK it would be the ICO. This is about the escalation to that supervisory authority. And there are some specific timelines within which we're expected to notify that breach, assuming it's feasible, within 72 hours. So it's quite tight timelines and quite important that you have a process and a mechanism for identifying breaches within those timeframes. One of the challenges I think within an SAP environment is actually knowing that breach has occurred in the first place, and a lot of organisations may have a breach process and policy that focuses on their network, but not necessarily something that actually focuses on their key applications. And I think it's something that's worth considering, given the implications of this legislation. It's definitely worth considering whether you have the ability to identify a breach in the first place. So on the assumption that a breach has been identified, and there are some ways in which we can support you in identifying breaches, applying various other tools, etc. to that. There's incident management functionality within the GRC tool that can be used to capture and log data breaches. You can also use that incident management functionality and the controls repository as a register of internal data breaches. So where you're required to hold a data breach register, I think process controls could quite easily be used in conjunction with potentially parts of risk management to capture and store that data breach information. And then obviously having all that information in there allows you to then escalate and workflow the next steps in the remediation activities that need to happen as a result of that data breach. For example, workflowing it through to the DPO to determine whether or not the supervisory authority needs to be made aware of this breach. And obviously, with those timeframes in mind, with that short period that you have to notify the supervisory authority of a breach, the use of some form of workflow capability to speed up the flow of information throughout the organisation and get to the point where you determine whether you're going to notify the supervisory authority or not is quite a critical part of achieving that compliance. So the next thing I wanted to mention was this concept of accountability. So within the legislation, there are some statements around the fact that the organisation needs to be able to demonstrate accountability for data privacy and data protection. And I think the process controls tool itself is perfect for this. It allows you to allocate control owners and make it very clear who's accountable for operating certain controls. It allows you to capture or to define a full set of control activities that you're going to operate to in order to manage your compliance and in order to ensure that you're remaining compliant. And obviously each of those control activities will have a control owner which totally fulfills that accountability point, really. And if you're operating those controls well, you'll be able to test against those, document document your compliance against those controls and the fact that they're operating effectively. And that obviously, gives you the ability to test those controls and then demonstrate subsequently that you've done that. So I think this is an area that the process controls tool really does excel in terms of demonstrating that sort of accountability point. I've given hopefully you can all read, so I didn't want to read everything to you on the slides, but I've given a few examples of the types of controls that you might consider documenting within there and operating within the tool. There's one there that around retention periods. So outside of the GRC toolset, there are a couple of other SAP tools that you should be considering to help manage your retention periods and to help manage your risk of from an archiving perspective. I think this is an area that a lot of organisations are going to find themselves non-compliant without doing something different. For example, if you've got an HR record, you might currently be archiving the whole HR record the minute someone leaves. But in actual fact, you wouldn't really have a reason to hold someone's emergency contact details the day after they leave. You probably do need to hold their pension details. So there's a number of areas within SAP and other applications where you're going to need to consider how you currently archive and start breaking those records down based on your ability to determine, or your ability to demonstrate consent and the fact that you have an implied consent to hold certain pieces of data. So I think, in that regard, the process controls tool could quite easily be applied against your archiving activities in order to be able to demonstrate that you're actually fulfilling those controls you've defined around archiving and retention periods. There's also a capability within GRC around policy management, and I think an important part of demonstrating compliance is being able to define or being able to demonstrate that you've got policies in place that make the individuals in your organisation aware of their data protection and data privacy responsibilities, and being able to demonstrate they've understood those as well. So the policy management tool within GRC can be used to, the policy management tool within GRC can be used to both distribute changes to policies or new policies, but also to operate some surveys within those policies to be able to demonstrate that people have actually read and understood them, maybe a short quiz or a questionnaire for them to answer questions or key poignant questions within those policies, so you can actually demonstrate that people have understood the policies that have been distributed to them rather than just received them. And you can have, if you set goals for each department to have completed those surveys, let's say 80-90% is a minimum for each department, you can use the issue management and resolution capabilities within policy management and within process controls to report on and escalate the completion of those surveys, etc. And I think this is so. One of the last sort of projects I was doing on the data privacy side of things, quite an important part of compliance in the data privacy space was around the transference of risk back to the individual. So what you really want to do as an organisation is be able to demonstrate that your policies and procedures don't really allow an individual or make an individual fully aware of their responsibilities in the data privacy and data protection space. And therefore, if you do have any issues, if you're able to demonstrate that was down to an individual's behaviour totally outside of your policies and procedures, that might give you some protection from certainly from higher fines, shall we say, if not complete protection. And so it's quite important to be able to transfer as much of that risk onto individual behaviour rather than the way that your organisation has defined things. And you do a lot of that through policy and communicating policy. So the last thing I wanted to mention was around sort of governance reporting. So SAP obviously have some nice dashboarding and Fiori capabilities now, and this is just an example of something that we could be putting together for a data protection officer, just to give them an overview and give them some of the key pertinent information that they might need at the point in time in order to demonstrate compliance. So some sort of dashboarding around that, so supporting the governance processes you need to operate around GDPR. And then finally, I just wanted to talk about the sign-off process. So there's some functionality built into the process controls tool, which has been specifically designed around the sign-off process for Sarbanes-Oxley originally. But it could be applied to any regulation, and I think it may be worth considering a more formalized process for signing off and demonstrating compliance up through the organization, so going from control owners right up through to the board signing off compliance, as a way of governing the process and ensuring that you are confident that your organization is operating the right controls, etc., to demonstrate compliance. So we've got a little workflow there, which illustrates how the control sign-off process works within process controls. So finally, we're getting towards the end, and I did want to leave a couple of minutes for questions. Just from a deployment options perspective, so we have a rapid deployment solution for the GRC tools. We actually have one for all three of the modules. But the process controls tool is the one that will give you the most value against GDPR compliance. And so what we've done is defined a flavor of our existing rapid deployment solution for process controls that just extends that deployment to include some of the key functionality that may not have been originally included, but is now included as a way of, because it's key to the GDPR compliance side of things. So, for example, activating disclosure surveys to support the data protection impact assessment process. We've got some rule sets that we're bringing to the table around access controls as well as the process controls piece. And we've really looked at our rapid deployment solutions and enhanced those where possible to make them more supportive of this particular legislation. We can offer that in two ways from a deployment perspective. The traditional on-premise deployment, where you've bought a license and software from SAP and you've bought hosting, etc., and you just want the deployment of the software and an implementation, through to a fully cloud-enabled deployment where we would host the solution for you and sell you effectively based on a monthly subscription, the hosting, license, software, implementation, and managed support. So we can get you up and running really quite quickly on that basis. So those are the kind of deployment options you have. So we're getting towards the end of the half-hour slot, so I just wanted to see if there were any questions out there.
So we've got a couple of questions, Richard. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
So I think it's probably building on your last point. So how long does it typically take to get SAP Process Control up and running?
To a large extent, that depends on the deployment model. If we're deploying on-premise, then it can be anywhere between sort of 8 to 12 weeks, something like that. Because and it'll also depend if you've actually got an access controls implementation in place already. It's going to be a lot quicker if you have. Under the cloud model, we can go a little bit quicker because we have more control over the end-to-end implementation, as it were. And so for that, you're looking at more like 6 weeks for that. Okay.
And there's another question, just one more. I don't know if any questions are coming directly to your chat box, but this other one has come in, which is really around SAP and their focus on GDPR. Is there anything they're doing specifically to help customers with GDPR?
Well, SAP themselves are obviously an organisation who have their own compliance challenges in this space. They're based in Germany, and Germany have traditionally had some of the most stringent data privacy regulations in Europe. They are, but I am aware that they're bringing out a compliance dashboard. I believe it's intended to support the DPO role, and I suspect there'll be some more enhancements coming later down the line. But we, as Turnkey, we've also, I think they also expect their partners to bring content to the table in this area, and that's where we sort of fit in from an implementation perspective. Chris Johnson's doing a webinar in a couple of weeks' time for us, and he's going to be talking about the roadmap around the latest release of GRC 12, which we've been sort of getting involved in some of the pre-testing on. And I believe he may mention the GDPR sort of functionality coming down the line as well in that. So okay. I'd say tune into that if you're interested in that topic.
And that's going to be sort of early March, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Well, I don't think we've got any more questions, and just conscious of time. So yeah, there's just a couple more things to talk through. So just back to you, Richard, on the workshop. Yeah,
thank you. The other thing I wanted to mention is that we're offering our customers a sort of free pre-sales workshop around GDPR. So what this is focused on is just helping you understand a little bit more about some of the key requirements that GDPR is putting in place, helping you kickstart a sort of gap analysis against what you might need to be doing around the GDPR in your organisation and what and where the GRC tools can support that, and helping you to put some sort of roadmap or in terms of your organisation's response. I'm aware that with the legislation sort of coming very soon, a lot of organisations will already be up and running on a lot of this. But I think the key thing that GRC is offering you is not necessarily a silver bullet for, or certainly not a silver bullet for solving some of the challenges, but a framework and a tool set for managing compliance on an ongoing basis and making that sustainable. I think it's very easy to do a lot of stuff with a big project, with a big budget, to remediate initially, but if you don't put the right governance processes in place on an ongoing basis, then that's where you're going to fall down. So that's what we're focused on in that workshop, is just understanding what you're going to need to do to stay compliant as much as you are to be compliant in the first place. Okay.
Thanks, Richard. Okay, so just before we close the session, just a few more GDPR-focused resources to mention, all of which are available on our website. So, at least 3 of those cover in a lot more depth many of the areas that Richard has covered today, particularly around process control. We also recently did a webinar with GB and Smith specifically on SAP Business Objects for GDPR. So be sure to check those out on the website. Again, we will send you a link with a recording of today's session. So maybe you can share that with your colleagues if they're not able to make it today. If you're interested in the workshop, please don't hesitate to get in touch for further information. But yeah, that concludes today's session. Thanks again, Richard, for taking the time to present. Thank you to everyone for listening, and we certainly hope to see you again soon.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Craig.